Welcome to the Push-Pull Podcast. I'm Varun Rajan, and in this podcast, I interview professionals about their careers, specifically around the push and pull factors that inform the big decisions and transition points in their careers. Today, I talked to one of my very good friends, Theresa Freet. She and I work together at an ed tech company called Thinkful and have remained friends for the better part of the last decade. She's a senior operations leader with over 12 years of experience in the ed tech field, and she's currently working on a fractional basis for a couple of different ed tech startups right now. What's super interesting is how diverse her experiences were before she actually got into being an operator at early stage startups. Early in her career, she really focused on work being something that enabled the life that she wanted to live, namely travel, new places, and experiences. The other thing was she also really exhausted the idea of passions as a vocation. And so we talk about her time in the food industry and what she learned as a result of pursuing that whole hog. The other thing that Theresa emphasizes quite a bit is how to get really comfortable with discomfort and uncertainty. She has put herself in a position very early on to step into the unknown and tackle life with a sense of fearlessness. You'll see every few years when she's in a point of transition, she has to worry about, does she have the transferable skills? Can she actually make it into the next phase of her career? But she leans into it and finds a way through in a way that redounds to not only her success, but also to the benefit of everybody that she gets to work with. The last thing that comes up is a constant focus on what lights her up. That phrase, lights me up, came up time and time again. She found the things that actually made her get into a flow state, click, advance, and see progress over time. I think that there is so much that we can learn both from Theresa's, I would say, second act so far, which is really about the actual work in tech, working as a strategy and ops leader. But there's also a ton of insights that can be gained from the early part of the conversation where we really talked about all of the risks that she took and the wild roller coaster that brought her to where she is today. Really excited to share this conversation with you and I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Theresa. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Varun. Yeah, super excited to be here. Excited to talk career and get the opportunity to chat with you for a little while.
Awesome. I want to turn it over to you, just a 30 to 60 second overview of who you are and what you do today.
Yeah, I am currently working fractionally for a couple companies after having spent the last decade plus building my skills as an operator across different ed tech spaces and now getting the opportunity to really take what I learned to drive forward some companies and cool ideas that I think are important that they exist in the world.
Let's take it back to the beginning. Where would you want to start the story of Theresa's career?
I think one of the most formative things that I did was actually decide to study abroad in Madrid in my junior year of college. I think it really unlocked my sense of adventure, a love of travel that I didn't necessarily have prior. And I think important for me career-wise, it unlocked a certain level of fearlessness. And I think comfort with risk-taking that has informed a lot of the decisions that I've made in my career after that point.
That's super cool. I would love to spend even more time on that. So just a quick overview of where you were coming from, where did you grow up, and what were the alternatives, right? Sometimes when we think about the choices that we made, it's not just what's pushing you away from where you were before, but also what are the trade-offs and opportunity costs for the other things that you might have pursued?
Yeah, I grew up in Southern California and had, through a series of decisions, studied Spanish in high school. Super fortunate, I went to college on a full ride, which meant that I had money that my parents had been saving to pay for me to go to college that was freed up for me to be able to consider doing other things. And so at that point, what stuck out to me most was this idea that I could study abroad and I could afford to do it for a full year. And for me, then the question became where. And I had actually studied Japanese for a while when I was younger, but it wasn't really good enough for me to think about making that like a college language. But I had taken AP Spanish. So was an easier transition. It was a little bit like more of a smooth transition to consider. They had a program in Madrid at my school, and it just made sense to go to Spain. And then I knew I wanted to do the year long because I could afford to. And actually, that ended up being what my major was, just because I spent so long in Madrid that I had built up enough credits to graduate with a degree in that, which is another like formative career lesson. In most cases, it actually does not matter what your major is. Like, I don't really use it. No one's ever been like, oh, that's super important that you studied Spanish. I guess actually having a Spanish degree did inform some of my later choices. After my senior year of college, I actually moved to Bogota and worked in university in Colombia for a year, which I suppose I wouldn't have done if I hadn't had like if I had a degree in Spanish. But
Yeah.
again, to that focus point, it was really like the question was, how do I get paid to be in other places, experience other cultures, get to travel, get to explore? And that was like the biggest pull for me in terms of what I decided to do across arguably the next 5 years.
So what was it
No.
that you were doing in Bogota?
So I was working at a university in their English department and basically helping their like full-time English teachers with like native style English speaking at a teachers college. So people who wanted to become English teachers were studying English to get their teaching degree. And so I supported and built out lessons and popped around to a bunch of different classes. So to some degree, teaching English is one of the easiest ways that like a native English speaker can get paid to be in other places. And so that was a little bit of a through line. It was much less about that type of what's next career wise and much more about what's next travel place wise. So I went back to the US for a year and did a year of AmeriCorps. And again, the sort of this like crazy moment of, do I have any real skills? Like, how do I get a job? And AmeriCorps has been, and I think probably still is to the degree that it's got enough funding, it's this cool opportunity to do work on a like for nonprofits that really pushes forward community good. And so I worked in Austin, Texas for a college access nonprofit. And specifically, my job was making sure that the students that we got into college stayed there. And I think that is also this interesting through line to later in my career where I've worked with high school students, college students, trying to really drive forward like career learning, education as economic mobility. And that
Yeah.
really became like the first place where I got to do that. But again, wasn't really the goal. It was much more focused on, all right, now I need a single year gap so that I can come back to the US and apply to go to Japan. But actually, in hindsight, was incredibly informative.
You were definitely a woman on a mission at that point, right? Like you could go to a bunch of different places and it wasn't like you necessarily got tired of one place or one job. It sounds like you knew that everything that you were exploring was going to be meaningful but temporary. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah.
Let me know if I'm getting
And
you right.
I
Yeah.
I think that is right. Like I just knew there was more, like more to see, more to do. And I wanted to get to see that next thing, do that next thing, at least at that point in time. This is all my early 20s. And like advice for anybody who's like very early in their career, I honestly think it's the best thing that you could do. Like you don't actually lose that much in terms of career trajectory towards your peers. And if you can afford to do it, like that period of time, I just had no ties. No, I had very little stuff. I had nothing that was like holding me back from doing that type of exploration, that type of travel. And I do think like that is a perfect opportunity to do it for anybody who can. And was like, I'm so glad that I took advantage of it.
So you did AmeriCorps. AmeriCorps was like something to tide you over while you figured out your next international trip.
Yeah.
So what came next after
Yeah. So next,
AmeriCorps?
I actually did then make it to Japan. So I used that year. I applied to do the JET program. Again, having learned
And
Japanese
what is
before.
the JET program?
It's the Japanese Exchange and Teaching Program. And so
Oh,
it's a
okay.
program that the Japanese government runs. And you apply for it and then they place you for a year and you can renew for up to 5 years. They place you for a year in a school district. And then if you are accepted into the program, the school actually chooses you and you don't get a choice. Maybe of relevance because I knew I liked traveling internationally, but I also had built up a level of confidence that like where I thrived was in larger cities. So I knew I didn't want to be somewhere super rural. I got my placement and it was in a little town that was connected to the main island of Kyushu, which is, for anybody who's not super familiar with Japan, like the main part of it, Honshu, looks like California, but flipped backwards. And then underneath is like a round blob Kyushu. And so it was like Kyushu about an hour and a half outside of Nagasaki, connected by a bridge and a bridge, like very rurally on this little island with 1,700 people. So
Wow.
super small. Primarily, anybody who lived there worked either they were a fisherman or they worked at a salt factory. And one town over, there was a shipbuilding factory, very rural, definitely the only white person for miles. And I had 30 people in the middle school class and about 60 people in the elementary school class. And then I worked 2 days a week on different islands that I actually had to commute to by boat. I would go by boat, one to an island that had 2 students total, and yet a full school, like a full staff for those 2 students of 13. And then the other had 5 students. I'm pretty sure I remember at the time it being because it wasn't legal to homeschool. So like they had to figure out a way to school kids on some of these smaller islands.
This is insane. How long was your daily boat commute?
It's like, I want to say it was probably like a half an hour. It wasn't that long. When the seas were rough, it was not great because it wasn't like a ferry. It was a 12, 16 person little speedboat. And the guy who was the boat captain was actually the father of 2 of the students. And then he would take everybody where they needed to go. And then he would just like fish during the day and then pick everybody up and take them home. And so sometimes, like, especially towards the end of the year when people were more familiar with me, he would offer me a plate of sashimi of what he had caught on the boat, like at the end of the day when I was leaving.
That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
Um,
Again, a hugely different life experience than being in big cities. And I think I learned how to function, but I do also think that was even more life proof for me in terms of where I actually really derived joy and where I thrived. It turned out not large cities or like in large cities, not in very small
well,
spaces.
yeah, tell me about that. You end up getting assigned to a very rural, not big enough for you to be in one classroom with
Yeah.
everybody that's been in other classes together. Like, it's a very unique situation. What were the things that stood out to you to reinforce, like, I need to be in a bigger, more bustling place?
I think the amount of time that I spent like on my own or wandering around the island, or like I used to drive an hour and a half to go have dinner with a friend and then drive an hour and a half home, which in retrospect is like an insane commute to have dinner for maybe an hour and a half. But
Hmm.
like that sort of missing like communal piece. And I had the opportunity to make some amount of friends, but I think there was a level of isolation, and also I was missing like the like bustle of being in a city space. Like when I would go into Nagasaki or into Fukuoka, which was the largest city on Kyushu, and I really loved being in it. Like I could just feel the energy of the city impacting me differently than being in the like quieter, more, and it was a beautiful place. Like the island was beautiful, like vegetation, Costa Rica, like gorgeous space, but just the way that like I could feel myself interpreting energy just felt very different than when I got the opportunity to be in a city.
Yeah, totally. Then, yeah, what came next? Was this one of those things with the JET program where, like, you could have stayed on for
Yeah.
longer or stayed in Japan
Yeah.
broadly for longer? Yeah.
You could stay on. It's actually, they tell you this because they know it's going to be a problematic period of time to make you make a decision. But you have to decide in February if you're going to stay on for another year, because if you're not, then basically they need to reassign your role to somebody else who needs the time to decide if they're coming. So you have to decide in February, and it's the coldest and darkest period of time. They're like, you will be
Wow.
miserable. Don't take that moment. Take like the entirety of your experience and decide if you want to stay. And I don't think I could really see past that point. And also knowing that I was like, I feeling a little isolated, I decided to
Yeah.
leave. As you'd expect, by the time that I left, it was July. It was gorgeous. Like beaches were open, and I was like, oh, maybe this would have been fine. But but from there, actually, one of the things that I noticed about myself while I was working is I got really into like cooking blogs and food. And a lot of times I spent a lot of my time thinking about what I wanted to make after work. And some of that was traditional stuff. Some of that was like American things that I missed. And I also saved a lot of money because I lived in the middle of nowhere and there wasn't a lot to spend money on. And you get this sort of a standard stipend of what you get paid, regardless of where you're located. So I saved a ton of money up and I decided what I wanted to do was go to a sustainable, like farm to table cooking program in Ireland based on
Wow.
a blog that I had read by a guy who I really liked his work. And so I had decided I was going to go home for the summer. And then in the fall, I was going to go to Ireland for 3 months and learn how to cook, or like
Wow.
more formally learn how to cook.
Okay. And so how was that experience and what came out of it?
Yeah, great. Also hilariously stressful in the silliest ways. It's a program called Ballymaloe, and it's just outside of Cork in like southwestern Ireland. They have a house that you can stay at that's a hotel, and then they have a cooking school run by a woman called Darina Allen, who is lovely, still running the program. And she's, I think, the Alice Waters of Irish cooking. So you learn everything. You learn everything is seasonal. Like they grow a lot of the stuff, they source a lot of the stuff locally, and you learn how to do everything from like knife skills and basics all the way through like French pastry. I have this very hilarious memory of bursting into tears as like this meticulously made pastry just oozed out the side in the oven. Like,
Oh.
even though like obviously it didn't matter at all. And you do this 3-month long program. And then towards the end of it, there's a final, you like propose a menu and you have to make it inside a time period. And then they grade you on it. And that's how they decide if you've passed out of this program or not. And the other thing that Darina will do is you can meet with her and she'll talk to you about what you want to do after. And what I learned when I was there is I loved bread. I was fascinated by making bread. It was one of the things we learned how to do, and I would do in my spare time while I was there. And obviously, her network is much more in Europe than in the US, but she had an introduction for me to a woman who worked at a wholesale bakery in just outside of New York City. I actually went and stayed with my cousin in New York for maybe a month and did a stage at this bakery, which was actually in Englewood, New Jersey, which is not New York City. It's like a train and a bus away. And then that woman actually entered, and that was actually Balthazar's wholesale bakery. For people who know New York City breads, like a pretty large New York City institution. And she actually recommended that I reach out to this other guy who had just started a bakery in Brooklyn called Bien Qui. And so I walked in with my resume, which is like a hilarious resume for trying to like do any food. I've done like a bunch of English teaching in other countries. Here's my Spanish degree. And he was like, yeah, sure. So the thing about working in food is like you can get your food in the door by just working for free in what's called a stage. And I spent 2 weeks working with him, and I would work like
What is a stage? Is it just
a stage
unpaid
is just
internship?
a
Is that
French way of saying like unpaid labor.
okay?
So it's a fancy way of saying we're not going to pay you to learn how to do these things.
Okay,
It's like
gotcha.
very common. And so I worked with him for about 2 weeks in these 10-hour shifts. And again, I was staying with my cousin who lived by the Columbia campus. And I would wake up at 1:30 in the morning and I would take the A train local all the way from Columbia all the way down to Brooklyn to
Wow.
like Hoyt-Skimmerhorn, which is a very long local ride for anyone who's familiar. And then I would work 10 hours and then pop out from the restaurant or like from the bakery at 3 p.m. And it was a very strange period of time. But at the same time, I had also gotten an agreement to go work at a farm in Northern California for a season. And so I knew I was leaving from there, from New York City and these two stages to go spend from like March. And at this point in time, I think it was like January, February. And so I was going to go
Huh.
from like March through end of summer, maybe like August, September, work on a farm in Northern California that was in the spring and in an environmental ed camp for alternative schools, like Montessori style
That's
schools.
So cool.
And then
Okay.
in the summer, it became a family camp where families would come and pay to stay by the week. And so I worked in the kitchen there. And then in the spring, I also taught kids how to make bread and like cinnamon rolls and cheesy biscuits and things like that. I knew I wanted to explore being in food a little bit more. I wasn't quite sure I wanted to work in an actual restaurant at that point. And so I was trying to find alternative ways to be in the food industry and that felt a little bit like lower stakes than trying to go be a line cook. And also that maybe had some kind of like finite period of time for me to figure it out. And so that ended up being one of it. It was a little farm called Immendal. And again, another great experience for me in validating like what types of spaces bring me energy, because it was about like 45 minutes down a mostly unpaved road outside of Willits in Northern California. So like very, very rural space, gorgeous, beautiful along the Eel River. But there were 16 of us that lived there, including the woman who owned it and her son and his family. And the degree to which all 16 people were just like so in each other's business, I was like, oh, like I need the anonymity of a city so badly.
What was it about food that really attracted you? Because we've told the story of I was in Japan, I started reading a bunch of
Yeah.
stuff, started cooking a bunch of things, and then I like went to Ireland, I got really into bread. I would be curious about what are the through lines there, or
Yeah.
like what do you find really valuable about food?
So I think there was some component of it being a way of connecting. So all this time while I was away, it was a means of connecting with my brother and my sister. And while I was in Colombia at Bogota, we started actually this like food challenge where one of us would pick an ingredient and then all three of us had to find a recipe and make something with that ingredient. And so
That's
this became
awesome.
like a point of connection, which I think probably helped foster it. But more for me, it was this really fascinating. And to this day, I still just love getting to try new recipes, explore things. Like I love finding a food or something I haven't seen before and getting to figure out like what it takes, like how I use it. So it was much more about this like love of food that I wanted to see if I could figure out how to incorporate that into work. And yeah, and so unlocking that with by going to a cooking school to actually then get a bit more training, get a bit more clarity on what it looks like to actually cook professionally, like what the skill level looks like to be able to bring some of that in.
Yeah. That's really great. Where did that end up? Or at least
Uh,
continue on
Yeah, yeah,
from where
yeah.
we left
So
off?
there's a continue on and then there's a cautionary tale at the end of it because I'm not in the food industry today. But so I left Immendal, and again at the end of that period of time, I started to figure out what I wanted to do next. And so I had both in and out of food. I had talked to some people in San Francisco, talked to some people in Denver, and I also reached back out to the guy at B&Qui, who the founder of B&Qui, who I had worked with, and he offered to let me come back and work as a full-time employee, come back and work as a baker in his kitchen. That ended up being what I decided to do. And actually, in part, thinking about that like push-pull factor of like how to decide San Francisco, which I'd spend a
Mm.
bunch of time in California. I grew up in California. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I'm 25. If I don't move to New York now, I don't think I'm going to move to New York. This might be just
Yeah.
like the point to try to go live in that city, knowing what I know about cities. And so it was less like the job was the dream job. And it was more like the job was an opportunity again to move to a city that I wanted to be in. And incredibly grateful that somebody was willing to let me go because for Zach, who had started B&Qui, this was like his like child. And he's, yeah, sure, you can come work in this kitchen. So I moved to New York and then worked for about 6 months at B&Qui, mixing and shaping bread dough. So spent a lot of time with bread. And I think the biggest thing I learned there is one, like my body was just not made for that type of work. I was developing carpal tunnel in my right wrist. But
Oh.
also it just completely diminished like my joy for bread because having to do it like on that type of cadence, like every day, that number of days a week, just really shifted my relationship to it. It became less something that like there was like joy and novelty to, and more of something that became like a must do. And that I think is actually probably the bigger lesson for me around like trying to right size what I like am passionate about and what's a hobby versus what's a career. Like the number of times that people are like, oh, this thing that you love, or if you're good at something, like you should do that for a living. And I'm always a little bit cautious around maybe, but actually sometimes things should just be stuff we do because we love it. Like in our,
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Because it's like not, and it doesn't necessarily mean you can't be successful or have a successful career with something that you're truly passionate about. But it's that when you make something that you're passionate about work, it becomes work. And all of the things that we associate with the things that we don't like about work, that is the things that are the necessary friction of keeping jobs going and the paperwork and the bureaucracy or whatever, right? Like
yeah,
you have certain mandatory inputs that you have to put into your work when, like, for bread, like
yeah,
you're not going to give yourself like an early morning marathon where you're shaping bread all day, every single day. That's not the thing that you would choose to do. But like when it becomes work, then
yeah.
that's your job.
And you don't get to choose what you want to do. You don't get to wake up and say, I feel like making this today. It's you've got orders, you've got commitments. Gramercy Tavern is waiting for this type of role. You have to do the same thing every day. And there are some people who really, find joy in it. Like I have some lifelong friends that I made at that period of time who truly love like the nuance of day to day, seeing what's different and getting to do that routine and that cycle on a day to day. And I just found that was not quite what lit me up. Like, I
Huh.
didn't find that kind of like meditative joy of being like, today it's slightly different. I wonder why. Let's think through this. Instead, it became like more of a chore.
This is really great and a really helpful lesson for a lot of people. I also feel like we were part of a generation that was like, do the thing you love. And there's always truth and value to that message, but there's always truth and value to like the flip side of, but then it becomes work. And you had a lot of other priorities, I think. And I guess the other thing that's really amazing about all of your early 20s story is that you followed not necessarily the work itself. It doesn't sound to me that you were purely strategic or even transactional about this is going to be good for my career. You were kind of like, this is the life that I want to live. And whether it's traveling to different places or actually cooking and baking, right? You're like, these are the
Yeah.
things that I love. And I'm going to find the opportunities that allow me to live that life.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. A lot of focus on what I wanted, what lit me up. And then to be fair, at a certain point, I had to come to terms with, oh, actually, at some point in time, I guess I got to figure out what's like a quote unquote real career versus hopping around from thing to thing. But that exposure, and I think what I learned from all of that was incredibly important. That lesson in getting the opportunity to do something that I thought I really loved doing and make it into work and then getting to see how that felt was really different. Because I think there are lots of people that still have this dream of, oh, I don't really like my job, but I wish I could one day like run a bed and breakfast or own an art studio. Like I started doing ceramics recently and people would be like, you should just sell your ceramics as a living. And I'm like, no, like I don't actually want to have to make 300 of the same mug. What I want to do is make one mug that I like and then like do something else. So it just was such a good formative lesson. And like sometimes hobbies and things you're good at, like you're allowed to just let them be expressions of joy. And then you can do other things that you love doing or that light you up or that, you care about, but that are actually more transactionally about funding the rest of the lifestyle that brings you joy.
Beautiful. That's awesome. Cool. What came next?
Yeah. So from there, I ended up leaving again. And so I had a really good friend of mine, Vanessa, who had a startup at the time. And she couldn't afford to pay me, but she could afford to like take me on board, give me the experience and also the cover in my resume to be able to start to transition into something that might look like a more traditional career. And so I worked with her for a little bit and then started doing a bunch of volunteer work and figuring out what I wanted to do next. What I was doing for my friend, so her tech startup actually, conceptually what it was is basically developers need to keep, so like software engineers, developers need to keep learning new and practicing their programming skills in order to keep fresh. And so she wanted to marry that with a push for more open source software and nonprofits. So help nonprofits open source their platform code in a way that like developers could build practicing rather than build another calculator app or
Cool.
like alarm clock
Okay.
tool, help basically
Right.
like fund this virtuous cycle. And so I helped her, just random jack of all trades. She was trying to get that off the ground. And she also ran a meetup called Developers for Good that was trying to do a very similar thing. So I helped her run that. And then I also was doing some work with a company that was trying to basically build out like food and nutrition and culinary skills as like a little food truck for high school students in the Brooklyn area. So it was basically trying to bring food and nutrition and cooking education to schools via this
So
little food
cool.
truck.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
and so that actually did tie in a little bit more of the food component. And yeah, I actually don't remember how I got connected to that, but that I would go work for them for a day a week, for my friend for a little bit. I was doing a little bit of odds and ends and different like food jobs to make some amount of money while I was doing it. And then also applying for things that say gave me healthcare.
Tell me about this time. Like, how long was the period between quitting the job that you had and starting the next one?
Yeah.
What were the pros and cons? Want to know. Obviously, there's this. They're like, I got to put food on the table and like get
Yeah.
healthcare eventually. That's obviously a huge drag to have. What else was notable to you about this time?
Yeah. So it was probably a 4 or 5 month long period where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And there is like a huge amount of stress, not quite knowing what comes next and being in that job seeking phase. We mentioned this earlier, but I think that through line of the moment of panic where you think, have I built any transferable skills that like I can cobble together into a reasonable facsimile of a job skill match? But also, it was cool in the sense that it was maybe my first taste of being fractional, in the sense that I was doing a bunch of different things and getting to like weave between different opportunities and get to focus on more than one thing that I was excited about or that was a priority.
All right, let's
Yeah.
get to the IIN.
Yeah.
We're finally at the most recent 12 years of your career.
In this point, right as I'm starting to think about joining Institute for Integrated Nutrition, which I'll from here on out call IIN, because it's just, I was actually the first point where I thought, am I going to stay in this place? So that up to this point, I had been moving basically like once a year for the prior 8 years. And I actually, at the time, remember looking at a job in Philadelphia and thinking, not quite ready to leave yet. New York has a certain type of energy. That's what I've been looking for. So I'm like building a community and a network here, and I don't think I want to move again. I ended up at IIN, and it was this nice marriage of I'd been working for my friend's tech startup for a little bit. And so I had some of this management, which also I think I had from being at doing the volunteer work that I was doing. And then what IIN does is they basically run a year-long program for people trying to get into health and wellness coaching and run their own businesses. So it's a year-long program with these 3 core pillars of nutrition and food and wellness and coaching experience and then entrepreneurial experience. And that was really my return to education. So I think after panicking that I had no viable skill set, I actually could pull together this narrative of I have a ton of education background, I have food background, I have this tech component. I actually am a good bet for this role. Started there doing like more project management, some like more entry level setup things, owning some different kind of programs. And yeah, I spent 3 years there, had the first of many incredible bosses. Actually, both of my bosses when I worked at IIN were just like unreal. I still think about like how incredible my first boss was in terms of I never asked for a raise the entire time I was there. She like proactively fought for raises and promotions for me in a way that I
That's
think
awesome.
informs how I try to operate myself now. Actually can't express enough how much she impacted my later career trajectory. Just in those 3 years, she probably single-handedly caught me back up to what somebody might have been at, like having spent all of their 20s working somewhere, which was pretty cool. Like she more than doubled my salary in the 3 years that I was at that company, which is no mean feat. As somebody who has been a manager and worked to fight for promotions and raises for my team, it's not easy to do. It's actually hard and constant. And the degree to which she was an advocate for me without me even having to like go ask for things was a gift. And I think
Yeah,
is something that maybe I didn't quite recognize at the time, but I definitely recognize now. And
that's awesome.
yeah, and then I think inside that also recognizing potential was able to give me opportunities to grow my skills and my career and grow myself as like a project manager, as a technical leader. It's where I got to advocate for a bunch of different trainings that I took that helped me level up skills wise.
Awesome. What were the things that you liked about working at IAN, and what were the things that you didn't like as much? And
Yeah.
curious what eventually led to you leaving there.
Yeah, I loved the people that I worked with. And I think this is broadly a through line for me. The team, it was all women, actually, I think the entire time I was there, who worked on the education and the content and operation side. Team was incredible. They were like so generous, incredibly caring, super smart. And it was fun to be at work with them. And is also the job with the most bananas benefits that I have had across my entire career.
Oh,
We
really?
had lunch catered every day. Every 2 weeks, there was like a 15-minute massage that you could choose
Oh my
to
god.
do. There was yoga classes 3 days a week after work in the building. Every Monday, they put a fresh flower on your desk. Like once a month, you got like a
Oh,
chocolate bar. It was like and there are more. I'm not even exhausting the list of options, but just a real deep dive after having worked in very non-tech spaces for what some of that benefit culture looked like, which I loved at the time. But I think the other thing I really enjoyed is that it was the first time that I really got to flex project management and also this through line for my career of getting to really find and optimize systems. So a lot of what I did while I was there is adopt different programs or systems or features that we offered and get to figure out how to run them better, make them work better for the end user, figure out why we were doing what we were doing, if it was actually the most useful way we could run, say, like a coaching program or
yeah.
a website offering,
Who?
like that.
Gotcha. Okay. So you're at this place. You're optimizing systems for the first time. You're deriving some like value
Yeah.
and fulfillment from that, obviously. What leads you to feel like it's time to wrap up your time there?
Yeah. So maybe about 2 years in, even, I started to feel some level of like friction or frustration with decisions more at the top of the company. Like I really like my managers, but I wasn't always bought into the decisions that were coming from the founder or like from the head, like lead of the company.
Mhm.
And for me, that began to feel like this point of, again, did I want to do this work? Did I want to have to show up and be in this space if I found myself like unexcited by directionally what the company was doing or what we were like pushing towards? And I think just as I found more and more decisions where I thought, I don't think this is the right thing. Do I want to have to show up every day and actually have to do this thing? If that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Well, and how did that? I think like a lot of people can resonate with that
Mhm.
sentiment. I'm curious about how that showed up for you. Did that result in additional tasks or work that you had to do that you were just, this is a waste of time? Or was it more like, well, if I'm showing up, even if the work itself is like bearable and I like it, if we're moving in a direction strategically that's going to actually shift the nature of my, like, what was it
Yeah.
kind of, how did your place in the company change as a result of strategic decisions being set at the top?
So I think for me, I'd grown a lot. I'd learned a lot over those 3 years in terms of project management, agile development, taking a Scrum course, and as a result was getting the opportunity to lead these larger projects like an LMS migration. And what I found frustrating was having built that skill set, it happened in tandem with sort of new leadership coming in that was coming from a less tech background, more of a traditional corporate background, didn't have that same experience, and was really bullish on doing things the way that they thought they should be done rather than deferring to what myself or other, like some of the product managers on the team understood to be doable, possible, the best course of action based on our learned experience, as well as what agile or development best practices are. And so I found myself just on a constant basis feeling like I was hitting my head up against this wall of a misalignment of skills and expectations that just led to it being very frustrating.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Did you start looking at that point?
At that point, I started to look. And again, the constant through line will be had that ever present panic of what did I do here for the last 3 years? Can I make this into a saleable resume that someone else will hire for something that's different? And actually, the friend who I had worked for at her tech startup originally came through in a hugely impactful way. And she actually connected me with someone in her network who was hiring. And that happened to be Daryl, who was the head of a company, Thinkful, which is where I landed next. And so she sent me an email saying, hey, this guy's hiring. He reached out asking for recommendations. Do you want me to recommend you? And so I said, yes, absolutely. As much as it was, I was frustrated and trying to leave. I think the other thing I was looking for at the time was like, given that kind of juxtaposition of feeling like the leadership wasn't necessarily aligned with what we were trying to build or how the company at IIN probably should operate as a tech company that lives and dies by an online app that people use. This company, Thinkful, I really liked the founders. I liked the way that they talked about the work they were trying to do. And that had been like a very important piece for me. I wanted to go somewhere where I trusted what the leadership was trying to do and that they like knew what they were doing at that time.
Yeah, yeah. I obviously don't need a whole primer on what Thinkful was, but tell the audience, this is where we met, obviously.
Yeah. So Thinkful was somewhere in the more traditional technical boot camp. So at the time that I joined, we just had software engineering programs. So we had a full-time and part-time program for people who wanted to transfer into software engineering as a career. And so it was this interesting through line for me. I didn't have experience with software engineering, but I had experience with people who were career switching into new careers via an online program. And the job they were hiring for was basically to run a full-time online program for people who were learning full stack JavaScript and wanted to become developers at the end of it. And so it ended up being this more logical transition than you otherwise might think.
Obviously, a long tenure in that job. So tell us a little bit about what was it like when you got there? How did it change over time? What were the kind of trade-offs? Were there any points at which you thought, I don't know if this is for me anymore?
I was there for about 6 years through a lot of change and growth. And I think one of the coolest things was my ability to learn and grow alongside the company. And especially towards the start, I think I was maybe employee 24. So it was this all hands on deck in various spaces. And most of the team worked out of an office in Brooklyn. Interestingly for me, now I prefer to work remote, but I think being in person with the majority of the company and with both co-founders, when I was more junior in my career, was just made a huge difference in terms of trust and their ability to take chances on giving me things to do that maybe I don't need anymore in my career, but made a huge difference at the time as we think about like remote work and when to be remote and in person. But yeah, the work itself, I think, was super interesting. I learned a lot about software engineering just by default, almost by osmosis. And that actually, we didn't touch on it, but I got my first management experience at IIN and it didn't go great because most of the time when you're a manager, you get like thrown in and they say, good luck, hope this works, figure out what you're doing. But actually, this was the first time that I managed, I think, more intentionally. So
Yeah.
in my first couple of years, I got the opportunity to start managing the team of instructors that led students through our full-time program. And then over time, uh, slowly built my team up to take over all of the support functions for what across all 15 programs and 2 different career tracks.
So you came in first, you program managing, finding efficiencies, making sure things are running, managing, and you start growing it. That's like a lot of you are taking on more and more
Yeah.
responsibility, and it seems like exponentially so over time, which is like really amazing because it sounds like there was a lot of trust being placed in you. At what point in time are you making these affirmative decisions and like having these conversations like with your managers versus like how the stuff just unfolding in front of you?
I think a mix of both. So to some degree, there were points across, especially the first 4 years, where I would say I can take that on. And again, because it's a smaller startup and things are a little more fluid, you have the opportunity to raise your hand for more work or more responsibility. And I had a lot of manager switches across my time at Thinkful, which I think is also pretty common for smaller startups that like org changes and things switch around. I think for me it was a mix of both. Some of me advocating to my manager and some of them saying, who can take this on? Let's have Theresa take on this new program or like this function, for example. Yeah.
Yeah. And part of this obviously is just inside knowledge, knowing, having
Yeah.
worked at Thinkful for many years, but you did talk about the kind of the value that you had gotten out of being co-located. But
Yeah.
over time, Thinkful became a far more distributed company. Everyone that was like reporting to you, the first people that
Yeah.
started reporting to you at the very least, right, were remote. Did you see any sort of like tension or transition or anything notable about the kind of transition to an in-person with a co-located office in Brooklyn to be like a largely distributed company?
Yeah. So I think actually, I'm sure people that we worked with would disagree with me, but I think actually Thinkful did a pretty good job of building a sort of hybrid workforce, put a lot of work into like how meetings should run in a way that felt inclusive for both in office and remote folks. Yeah, almost I think exclusively across my 6 years at Thinkful, my entire team. I think there were maybe 2 people over time that worked out of the in-person office, but most of my team was remote. And I think experiencing that kind of shift and trying to do my best to balance out in-person versus remote probably it made me definitely more thoughtful about trying to build in like that community piece or like some amount of camaraderie, collaboration. Like it made me much better about thinking through transparency and what
Hmm.
teams needed to know if they weren't in person in offices.
Yeah. How many people did you end up managing?
Started with it when in my first year I was an individual contributor, and then in my second year I started managing a team of 3, and over time that grew to be I think probably like 30-ish people who are full-time across both the US and Delhi in India, and then also about 150, 170 part-time employees, and then a network of about 400 contractors that all rolled up into my area of the business.
Wow, that's a lot. What I would want to know,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of people would want to know, like going from an individual contributor to a manager role in the first place, I think is something that like I've heard people like agonize over and like, try to
Yeah.
figure out, okay, is this actually right for me, etc. Was that a natural progression for you? And then from going to, hey, I've got 3, maybe 4 like people under my
Yeah.
employ who I'm like responsible for their success in a lot of different ways, delivering feedback, going to bat for them, that growing to 30 FTEs and like there's a lot there. And so I'm not even sure where to start in asking like what were the friction points? What were the points at which you like maybe thought that, hey, I'm really good at this? Or what were the points where you were like, I need help with this? Where did that help come in? What did that whole journey look like?
Yeah, definitely points of friction. I think one of the things that I learned to do over time, and we'll find out in the comments section from people I used to manage, but I think I became better at delegating over the course
Mm.
of that period of time, which I think is one of the most important things you can do both as a manager and as a manager of large teams, and understanding that there are like levels of delegation. So one of the things I think that I really struggled with at IAN and then I became better with at Thinkful was there's different types of delegation you can do based on the person's level and how much you trust them. And so getting to the point of understanding my team, their strengths, what they're good at, and how to drive good performance from them, as well as knowing who I can task with what level of complexity and who I need to work with more tightly, or who needs much more structure in the asks that I make and who needs not a lot of structure and can run with things, was one of the biggest ways in which I managed that large team and managed that transition. I think to that point of that earlier conversation of the excellent manager who always advocated for promotions for me, the bigger the team, the harder it is to keep everyone happy.
Yeah.
And for me, I think not being afraid of hard conversations is probably the other thing that I really worked on as a manager. Was I didn't want anybody to feel blindsided ever by a decision or by what was going to happen, or whether or not they were doing a good job, getting a promotion. And so I really tried to, one, have constant touch points, whether it was weekly or biweekly check-ins with all these various folks, to be able to keep them in the loop, but also make sure that they didn't have any kind of open question marks around how they were doing, what they should expect, like what was expected of them. And that I think is the other thing that I thought a lot about as I was managing that team. I did very little to actually build out any of the programs. A lot of what I did was figure out the containers and how we actually would run things and how we'd make sure that they were successful. So one of the things that I loved doing and was proud of doing was building out kind of our QA system of what does good look like? How do we tell? Like, what are the KPIs we need to measure? What are the service level indicators of like how fast we need to get back to students we need to measure to know that all of these complex systems we've built are on track and working so that we can respond more quickly, or we know the right number of staff to task against any assignment. And that was this complex system that took a ton of time to build, but definitely wasn't something I was building alone. It was like in tandem with this whole team of folks who were like tasked against individual pieces of it. Again, that piece of delegating, like how I had to think at this higher level and then be able to parse out work amongst a team to be able to drive through what it actually looked like on the ground.
Yeah. And it sounds like you felt like empowered to do that in a lot of ways. So it's like,
Yeah.
I hear this kind of through line a little bit starting with IAN, and where you're, I get to really focus on operational efficiency. And now you're in a place where over time, not only are you doing that, what your purview is maybe gets split a little bit across people and like making sure that they're effective at doing the things that you were doing, largely responsible for, and not one-to-one as to like exactly what your role was, but you're delegating, you're hiring, you're delegating, you're managing. There's the people aspect. And then when it comes to the actual operational aspect, you're also like a little bit more removed from the implementation of all of those things and like all of those specifics. And the job itself gets like abstracted a little bit more. That's what
growth
in an ops role feels like to me. Yeah.
It's absolutely what it looks like. And you have to be really intentional about pulling yourself out from doing individual work at some of those points, like answering the email, implementing the individual thing, because you're trying to basically have that 10,000 foot view and then be able to give the right guidance, direction, feedback, ask the right questions so that everybody who is actually then doing that next layer of work knows what they need to do, is getting the right inputs, is actually like getting unblocked in the right ways. I think one of the things I learned at Thinkful was part of being a good manager is just figuring out how to unblock your team, whether it looks like getting other stakeholders in the room that they need input from, whether it looks like helping them with skills training if there's something missing that they need. Like that's just a huge piece of how to be an effective manager, is figure out what your team needs and then like how do you advocate for getting it for them.
You're managing more people, you're achieving more in terms of what your team is actually able to deliver on, and it's measurable. It's
Yeah.
fantastic. What comes next?
Yeah.
What's up for you?
Thinkful gets acquired by a company called Chegg, which is a larger player in the ed tech space. And that became, in and of itself, its own transition. There are many hours of story, what it's like to be acquired and going through that process. But that moved us from a company of about, I think, 180 or so to being a part of a 2,000 person publicly traded company. And so I learned a lot also in those 2 years post acquisition of getting to work with bigger teams, like getting to work with really robust legal teams as I worked with contractors and did workforce management, getting to work with really strong people ops and like HR teams in a much more structured environment. But it also came with a lot more constraints and top down pressure around cost and margins and thinking through what it looked like to scale this company at the next level. And again, had really great opportunities and great managers and got to do a lot that was cool inside that larger structure. But at a certain point, started to feel this friction of wondering if my own career growth and like trajectory wasn't quite in sync with the company's growth. And so was I able to take that next step into more senior leadership, or was I stuck slightly more in now a like middle management role at this much larger company? And there became a point in those 2 years where even though I was well compensated, the work was interesting, I loved my team, I had this friction point of saying, actually, I think I want to be someone who has more of a like stake in the strategic decisions we're making and the larger picture thinking. Is that possible at a company this size with my experience level? Or do I want to move into something a little bit smaller where I can have that more like senior level strategic role? I had experienced a lot of like promotion and growth, but there felt to me like a disconnect in terms of my ability to move like that higher level big picture strategy. And that was the
Yep.
piece that I wanted to be able to, that was a skill I felt like I was missing and I wanted to build if I wanted to actually like level up myself as an operator, as somebody who might someday be like a COO of something. That kind of level of strategic influence felt missing, and I didn't see a path towards getting to practice that at Chegg.
Yeah. So if we're thinking about the push factor of Chegg, it's not like you were capped on your compensation or your titles and all, right? Like it's very much about the level of responsibility that you could have that actually has influence and impact over the organization. Yeah, totally makes sense. So push pull factors, what was pulling you to your next gig?
Yeah. So actually, interestingly, at the time, this is the maybe first and only point in time in my career so far where I didn't have that moment of, oh my God, do I have functional, useful skills? I had the good fortune of a couple people who I had worked with in the past reaching out to me about 2 different opportunities. So I was in conversation with 2 different teams that were looking to do things very similar to what I was doing at Chegg. And so I ended up at a company called Polygence. And what Polygence does is they run research mentorship programs for mostly high school students, but students who want to explore something that's outside what they can access in their K-12 education. And we would pair them with a mentor who is a near peer. So like a grad student, a PhD holder, but younger, who could talk them through both how to do research as well as the actual subject matter expertise for things like quantum physics and like 3D
Wow.
printing and the diplomacy of the Arctic regions and cool things like that. And then they would basically build some sort of research project together, whether it was like a physical prototype of something. I remember there was one kid who was like exploring basically wind shape in air tunnels and doing it via design systems. So sometimes it might be a prototype, sometimes it might just be a research paper that they're writing together as they learn the process. And the thing that I thought was really cool about what they were doing was I'd spent a lot of time helping people switch careers if they decided at some point in time in their career that they had made the wrong choice and wanted to do something else, whether it was health and wellness coaching or software engineering or design. And there's something very cool about working with high school students to validate what they're interested in before they start college, before they start their career, trying to help them like make a decision that they were excited about and validate that it's something they actually want to do before they get into it. And then also I just remember meeting like the head of product and the head of marketing from those teams and like really just like loving the conversations we had, the way they thought about their work and thinking, yeah, these are people I want to be my peers.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what did they hire you for? What were the analogies between the role that you had at Thinkful and Chegg? Like similarities and differences. Did you feel like the thing that you weren't getting at Chegg was something that you were getting more of at Polygence?
Yeah, they hired me basically to lead customer operations. And so that was both the more traditional customer support roles, which is something I had taken over at a certain point in time at Thinkful, as well as starting to run through at the start mentor operations, but also the admissions flow. And eventually what I took over as well was some of the earlier product launch as we expanded what our offerings were. And there was a ton of overlap. They obviously had a huge pool of mentors, which was something I had experience managing from my time at Thinkful, as well as just managing the operations of running remote programs, like online remote programs. And in terms of thinking through like that, what was missing and what felt right is so it was two first-time co-founders. And I think what I was excited to be able to bring to the table was a lot of what I had learned across the previous 9 years at both IAN and at Thinkful in terms of what are how do operations scale? What works, what doesn't? Almost like pattern recognition, because this was a company at an earlier stage and I could see and help drive things into a more useful, scalable direction.
Yeah. And what were the kinds of things that you movie thought were going to be like easier coming into a role with a bunch of pattern recognition? I've done this stuff before. I've seen this movie before. It sounds like maybe you encountered a lot of that at Polygence. I'd be curious to know, A, if that's accurate, and B, if it wasn't quite as simple as Theresa's coming in as a soothsayer.
Yeah. So I think there were two pieces to that. So one, I was surprised how much I could recognize from having been in other slightly more mature processes of what was going to work and not. I remember early on looking through some of the workflows for the admissions team and the broader sales team and saying, actually, this should probably shift. And, it took time to actually prove out why that was, but I could take that and do that pattern matching. And then the more challenging part was having not had 6 years of all of the trust that I'd built up at Thinkful with leaders and with peers, I had to rebuild all of that or come with really robust data to be able to prove out why they should take like what I was seeing at face value or why we should act on what my instincts were, because I wasn't used to having to come with like that level of receipts, if you will.
Yeah.
And so that was definitely one piece of learning curve.
What was the kind of like realization of when you got to having to bring receipts? Was it like you had encountered friction and then you brought some receipts just because you were being so frustrated and then you were like, I should have done this the whole time?
So I remember one piece of, there was a process that we had with when the deadline for students and when the deadline for the internal sales team commissions were. And it was the same day. And I remember saying, actually, that doesn't feel right. They should surely be further apart. And getting told, no, it's fine. And then finally, 2 months later, we actually then got the data from our incredible data analyst who said, actually, when we put these two things together, like via all of the behavioral consequences of this deadline and that and how the team acts, like we're converting much slower. And then it was like, we changed it a week later. Like it was a no-brainer. But what we needed was basically someone to say, here's the data that shows why this isn't working. And what I could do is say, I've seen how this type of team operates. Like this can't be the right approach, but I didn't have the data to say quantifiably the team is slower at making those switches. And so that actually was a really interesting point for me to say, oh, I see. This is actually how I need to think about coming in. Like one, the data is what will tell the better story. It shifted how I think about like wanting to find and come in with the data as a piece of the argument. And then I think it also for me was that point of realizing, oh, I actually need to build my cases for things differently here than how I've had to in the past.
Now,
Yeah.
what I'm curious about, as someone who started as an individual contributor and gained a lot of direct reports, what was it like going into a role as a leader as opposed to the role that you were in before, which you established yourself and grew into a leadership position over time?
Yeah, I underestimated how much I would need to shift to fit inside the new culture. And so it was almost less about coming in as a manager. I think a lot of how I thought about managing a team, I could articulate well to this new team and try to tell them how I wanted to operate, try to understand how they wanted to operate. But the biggest shift for me was actually culturally moving from one company that operated in a very specific way and where you had to operate in a very specific way to get heard, to get things done, to a company with a very different communication style, collaboration style. And one of the things that my manager at Polygence did that I'm super grateful for is actually this 90 days into my job there, she did a 360 round of feedback with my peers and my direct reports. And I got a ton of very critical feedback around how I collaborated, how I communicated with my team in meetings. And I was honestly quite shook. It was communication is something I think I'm pretty good at. I think my EQ is pretty high. And so, one, it was like an exercise in absolutely removing ego from the tail because nobody likes to hear, actually, everybody thinks you're doing a pretty bad job. I'm so sorry. But it was honestly one of the most valuable pieces. It's one of the most valuable things she could have done because it gave me the opportunity still relatively early to get to course correct and also to understand what I was doing. So like the next time that I move into a different team and system, I can be more thoughtful to how I want to adapt to how they communicate and collaborate. Because a lot of the maybe more like brusque, very forward, like to the point types of communications that got me where I was going at Thinkful and at Chegg then didn't work in the more academic setting where there was more of a focus on collaboration and everybody participating in the conversation, everybody deciding together. And so I think I just hadn't quite come to understand what it would look like to shift from all of the habits and routines that I had built over the past 6 years into a different system. And I couldn't just move myself into it and assume it would work.
Yeah. Yep. Totally. That's really insightful. So let's talk a little bit about what happened at the end of your time at Polygence.
So unfortunately, it's a very common tale across most of the tech industry and ed tech specifically. Just 2024 didn't necessarily end up being the year of growth that the company was anticipating. And so we ran a round of layoffs in May of 2024. And then with the size cut that we were making, it just didn't make sense for my role to still be there at my level of seniority. And so that ended up not being that was much more of, say, like I guess a push than a pull in terms of how we're thinking about it. But also has been this really great way for me to get back to that comfort with discomfort, comfort with unknown. So nearly immediately after finding out that I wasn't going to be at Polygence anymore, I bought a ticket to travel in Asia for a little bit and decided to embrace what are the things that I haven't been doing because I've been in more of a like 9 to 5 structured job that I can get back to doing and give myself the sort of the luxury because I could of being able to return a little bit more to that like exploratory roots.
Yeah, that's really nice. How long have you been doing that for? And like, how are you living that out today?
Yeah, I did that for maybe 4, 5, 6 months. And then I started to try to figure out what it actually looked like to do, like what I wanted to do next, because I still live in New York. It's not the cheapest place to live. Eventually, I have to figure out what comes next. And so my ideal goal was figure out, do I want to be fractional? Do I want to return to something full time? And spend some time exploring that, talking to companies. And then where I've landed is being in a couple different fractional roles, using, again, the experience that I have and getting to do that kind of cool like pattern matching and having been now through 3 different companies with very different experiences, but a through line through each to be able to help drive forward some operations at smaller startups that are maybe on the earlier stage of some of what I've seen through my time at other companies. Interestingly, like both of the 2 things that I'm working on currently came in through unexpected routes. So I'm actually working with a former colleague of ours, Bomik, who was my first manager at Thinkful. And he has built a company called Atrium Academy, which is basically almost like a boutique training program for right now folks in the crypto space. And it's really about helping drive talent. So basically finding talented developers who can build in these ecosystems and then giving them the tools and the training to be able to contribute to different crypto protocols and ecosystems and be able to contribute to those companies and like what they're building. And knew nothing about crypto, still don't know that much about crypto, but what I do know about is like building education programs and how to scale operations at tiny systems. And it's been cool to get to put that in practice, work with Bomik again, and also get to once again kind of learn about this new space that I knew nothing about prior, but is obviously a very much in demand talent market. And then the other thing that I've been working on is actually something called Real Education. And that, again, in the ed tech space, but what it's focused on is basically trying to fill a skills gap need for Gen Z or younger folks coming into the workforce of they learn all the hard skills and they maybe have some of the social emotional learning, but what they don't have is like these practical skills of understanding how to basically flourish as individuals, as parts of a company, as like in their future careers. So helping to build in some skills in the practice of understanding what gives them energy, to fold back to like our earlier conversation of figuring out what lights you up, just the practicalities of what does it look like to get enough sleep and moderate like your intake of various things and make sure that you're doing like the exercise and whatever so that your body feels right. Like, how do you build in the anti-fragility of taking on hard challenges and not letting them depress your motivation or your confidence levels, or like, how do you use those to like keep building? How do you like remove the self-imposed blocks for what you decide you can and can't do? And so it's a very cool program that we're working to embed with colleges, with other schools, and help build this as a core piece of what an individual needs in order to be able to like fully flourish and come into themselves and live a meaningful life that they derive a ton of value from.
I really love how many of the through lines, like throughout your career, including what started at the beginning of just like essentially putting yourself in a position to live the life that you want to, and then still finding the things that kind of like light you up, over time, finding operational efficiency, being in like the early spots of finding like new educational models and things that are missing in the world, and doing it in a fractional way. Also right now, it sounds like that is maybe could be a longer term thing for you, maybe could not. It sounds like
I think if you asked me like 10 months ago what I was going to be doing now, I don't think I had an idea. If you asked me 12 years ago, 20 years ago, what I was going to be doing at this point, I am a firm believer in not necessarily trying to like decide the exact thing in advance. So right now, like these are 2 things that I really care about driving forward and that have been incredibly fun to get to work with the folks that are building them, and excited to see what they turn into as we build them out and launch them.
This is awesome. All right. Thank you, Theresa. Thank you so much for taking the time. This was super fun. And
my pleasure. You're welcome for the monumental editing task that I have set up on you, but
it's great. I asked for it.
Yeah. What comes out of this is useful to other people, that maybe people see a little bit of themselves or like what they've shifted through, what's worked or not for themselves. And if it inspires just one person to go travel instead of be at their laptop, then I think that's in and of itself a success.
I love that. Oh, that's wonderful. Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, Theresa.
You're welcome.
There you have it. That was my conversation with Theresa. We had recorded for about 2 hours, and so whittling that down to an hour 15-ish was actually really difficult. I really loved everything that we were able to talk about, and I still think that the early parts of her career are super instructive and really inspiring. I find Theresa's courage truly admirable, but I also think her approach to her traditional career is also incredibly instructive. She's very clear-eyed about what it takes to advance professionally. Her insights into what it actually takes to get into a management role and continue to advance is a really laser-in focus on delegation. I wish I actually spent more time with her on that. It sounds like she was really effective at understanding a bit of complexity, making sense out of it, and then hammering out the inefficiencies of it. And then as she built trust within an organization and was able to hire or manage people under her in order to take care of some of those smaller problems, she was able to solve more systemic problems at a higher level and being able to implement that by delegating. And that's how you become an effective operations leader over time. And it's funny because everything I've learned about management and everything I've seen from people who are really effective leaders reflects exactly the kind of thing Theresa shared with me today, but I haven't heard it articulated as well as Theresa was able to articulate it today with the examples that she had given throughout her career. So I hope you found this inspiring, and if you are a little bit earlier in your career, or if you're a little bit stuck and don't know what to do, maybe close your laptop and buy a ticket to somewhere in Southeast Asia. But otherwise, I had a real blast, and if you can, hit me up with a follow or a subscribe or a like on whatever medium that you're listening to this or watching this on. Leave me a review or a comment and let me know what you think. Thank you so much.